Picture George Washington. You're probably seeing that stoic face on the $1 bill, right? Or maybe a towering marble statue of America's ultimate founding father. But honestly, the reality behind that myth, it's a fascinating story of a highly pragmatic, deeply flawed, and just incredibly resilient guy. Welcome to This Explainer. Let's dive right into the actual reality of his life. So here's a really wild paradox. We usually imagine Washington as this godlike military genius effortlessly sweeping the British off the map. But the reality is way more compelling and honestly much more impressive. He actually lost more battles than he won. So how on earth did a general with a losing track record manage to birth a whole nation? To figure that out, we're going to break his life down into 5 key parts. 1. The making of a myth. 2. Sparking the revolution. 3. Commander-in-Chief. 4. The first president. And 5. A complicated legacy.
All right, part 1, the making of a myth.
Long before he was considered a master strategist, Washington was just a headstrong, kind of green colonial soldier. Back in 1754, when he's just 22 years old, he leads a small force into the Ohio country wilderness, and things go south quickly. After a skirmish ends with a French diplomat dead, literally sparking an international incident, he hastily throws together this wooden structure called Fort Necessity. It was an absolutely terrible defensive spot. The French and their Native American allies attacked, and he was forced to surrender after losing a third of his men. Just a completely humiliating, devastating mistake right out of the gate. The big takeaway here is that his early military career wasn't defined by some inherent natural brilliance. It was defined by a massive capacity to fail forward. He desperately wanted a royal commission in the regular British Army, but they constantly denied him, looking down on him as just some colonial. But he kept at it. During General Braddock's disastrous defeat, Washington bravely rallied the troops, literally having 2 horses shot right out from under him. He learned from these brutal, bloody failures. He saw how effective the enemy's mobile tactics were, and he learned the hard way that defending poor positions was totally futile. And those lessons, they're exactly what would eventually save the American cause. Moving on to part 2, sparking the revolution. Things escalated incredibly fast. After the French and Indian War, Washington retired to Mount Vernon as a wealthy businessman. But he was getting more and more frustrated by heavy debts to London creditors and a super volatile tobacco market. And then the British taxes hit. The Stamp Act in 1765 and the Townshend Acts in 1767 hit the economic interests of American colonists right where it hurt. By the time the Boston Tea Party in 1773 prompted the British to retaliate by completely shutting down Boston's port, Washington was absolutely furious. He wasn't just an annoyed businessman anymore, he was getting radicalized. In 1774, he teamed up with George Mason to draft the Fairfax Resolves, making a bold declaration. Taxation and representation are in their nature inseparable. By the time he rode into Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, those early economic gripes had forged a powerful, unyielding political philosophy. He was totally ready to resist. Part 3, Commander-in-Chief. When they made him Commander-in-Chief, he inherited an army that was, well, barely an army at all. Just put yourself in his shoes for a second. By the time the British descended on New York in 1776, Washington had maybe 14,000 ill-equipped, totally inexperienced Continental men fit for duty. And what were they up against? A staggering 32,000 highly trained British soldiers backed by 70 warships. It was an almost impossible situation, and honestly, his early command was plagued by one near disaster after another. Even deep into the war, he was still making massive tactical errors. Take the Battle of Brandywine Creek in 1777. Washington braced for a frontal assault but totally failed to prep for a flanking maneuver. British General Howe completely outwitted him. The fallout was devastating, 1,000 Continental casualties compared to just 500 for the British. It was so bad it actually forced the Continental Congress to evacuate their capital in Philadelphia. Yet somehow, amidst these crushing defeats and those brutal, freezing winters where his army was literally on the verge of melting away, Washington proved he could pull off these audacious, history-altering strikes. Just look at the famous Christmas crossing at Trenton. The plan was incredibly daring. Step 1, march 2,400 men across the freezing Delaware River in the middle of a fierce night snowstorm. Step 2, use the terrain and artillery to catch the Hessian mercenaries completely off guard. Step 3, pull off a lopsided victory. They captured 900 enemy soldiers and suffered fewer than 10 Continental losses. It was exactly this kind of sheer unpredictability and element of surprise that kept the dying American cause on life support. Ultimately, though, the victory wasn't secured by Washington acting as a lone wolf. It was a combo of his sheer endurance and the absolute critical necessity of his French allies. When the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse trapped the British at Yorktown, and a combined French-American ground force laid siege, British General Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. When that news finally hit London, British Prime Minister Lord North famously threw his hands up and said, "Oh God, it's all over." Washington essentially held the army together just long enough for that decisive blow to fall.
All right, part 4. The first president.
After winning the war, Washington was arguably the most powerful man in America. He had this fiercely devoted army at his complete disposal. But then, he did something that shocked the entire world. He surrendered his immense military commission to Congress and just went home to his farm. He consciously modeled himself after Cincinnatus, that ancient Roman general who gave up his dictatorial powers after saving Rome. By simply walking away from absolute power, Washington instantly calmed the widespread panic that he secretly wanted to be some sort of hereditary king. Of course, that retirement didn't last long. He was called back to preside over the Constitutional Convention and then unanimously elected as the first president. In office, he surrounded himself with brilliant minds, which directly led to a legendary cabinet rivalry. On one side, you have Alexander Hamilton, aggressively pushing for a powerful federal government and a national bank. On the other side, Thomas Jefferson, who was deeply suspicious of central power and terrified of a despotic presidency. Now, Washington lacked the deep theoretical and intellectual vision of those two guys, but his slow, incredibly deliberate leadership style was exactly what was needed to mediate the bitter birth of the two-party system. He listened closely to both sides, though he did ultimately favor Hamilton's vision of a strong national government, proving himself to be a highly pragmatic leader.
Which brings us to part 5. A complicated legacy. We absolutely cannot talk about Washington without addressing the glaring contradiction at the very center of his life, the paradox of liberty. He dedicated his entire life to establishing a nation founded on the principles of freedom and equality. And yet, his vast personal wealth, his entire status as a Virginia planter, depended entirely on the labor of over 600 enslaved people. It is a stark, very uncomfortable reality. Over time, Washington did undergo a profound shift in conscience. He came to recognize slavery as an economically inefficient institution, and he eventually refused to sell enslaved people because he didn't want to break up their families. But he couldn't bring himself to dismantle the economic system his livelihood depended on while he was alive. He kind of naively hopes the institution would just naturally die out, effectively kicking the explosive political issue of slavery down the road to future generations. He did, however, take the highly unusual personal step among his peers of leaving a will that stipulated the freedom of his enslaved workers upon his wife Martha's death. So when we contrast the infallible marble statute legend we're all taught with the highly pragmatic reality of the man, a really clear picture emerges. The myth tells us he was an undefeated tactical genius. The reality is, he actually lost more battles than he won and was mostly saved by his stubborn resilience. The myth says he won the war entirely single-handedly. The reality is, he was completely dependent on French naval and ground support at Yorktown. The myth paints him as the sole architect of the government. The reality? He relied super heavily on the intellectual brilliance of guys like Hamilton and Madison. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this question to ponder based on everything we've looked at today. Was George Washington a truly brilliant, indispensable leader? Or was he a somewhat mediocre general who was just buoyed by brilliant allies and subordinates? Does his reliance on others and those early battlefield blunders diminish his greatness? Or does his incredible resilience, his willingness to walk away from absolute power, and his ability to hold an impossible, fracturing union together make him exactly the leader history required? It's a fascinating puzzle, and honestly, the reality of the man is undeniably way more interesting than the myth. Thanks for joining me.